You mentioned George Soros a few times. He wrote, I remember an article back in the 90s where he argued that NATO needed partnerships with Eastern European countries because the NATO countries, the Western Europeans and Americans, they were always apprehensive when there were too many body bags which began to pile up. But if they could mix Western weapons technologies with I guess Eastern European meat or men, then this was effectively what they needed for NATO to be a big fighting force. But I did want to ask you because George Soros is always mentioned as a very key player, indeed, as someone financing the Democratic Party and the Open Society. It's these NGOs which he operates. They seem to work very much hand in hand with the U.S. government. Why is George Soros so important in this larger use of NGOs to capture the civil society and media of various countries?
Well, it's because he's the single largest political donor to Democrat political campaigns. For example, in the last election cycle, he gave $100 million to Democrats. The second largest donor was only $40 million. So the Soros enterprise is 2.5 times more influential. He who pays the piper calls the tune. The biggest donors get to pick the personnel. These are favors that are owed by the president to their donors, lest they no longer get the donations in following election years. And so the Soros network gets to effectively pick the personnel who man and staff the State Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon, USAID, and this extends not just to the direct personnel there, but also within Congress. Mark Warner, for example, who is the Democrat head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, got over $14 million from Soros family members for his Senate races under the Friends of Mark Warner. And so this determines what Ned does. This determines what the CIA does. And what you see is this very, very deep relationship between the CIA and the hedge fund world. I don't look at the Open Society Institute as being an NGO. I look at it being simply the action arm of the George Soros Management Fund. Whenever you see a Soros protest or a Soros political push in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Mongolia, you name it, you can bet that there is a Soros portfolio company that the Soros hedge fund is either long or short on, that Open Society Institute action is designed to maximize the profits of. Now, it's important to understand that Soros is not the only person who's involved in this game. It's hard to find a hedge fund in the United States, or a private equity fund, or an alternative asset fund, or a London banker who's got billions of dollars of assets under management, who does not play this political influence game to some extent. But the reason that Soros is just a very clean figure to analyze, to understand how this power structure works, is because these roots go back a very, very long time with the Soros family. And it was how the hedge fund effectively operated from the 1980s onward. And if you go, for example, to WikiLeaks and you look at the State Department cable leaks, and you simply plug in the name Soros, you will see the U.S. State Department doing favors for the Soros family going back to 1973. This is how long this has been going on. George Soros had an older brother, Paul Soros, who is a magnate in shipping, freight, infrastructure, port development in the Cold War, 1973. This is before the Church Committee hearings in 75 and all of this. And you can simply read WikiLeaks emails of State Department cables with U.S. embassies in Iran and Gabon working to make sure that Paul Soros lands the contracts for infrastructure and port development deals in Iran, in Africa, and this again when Iran was under U.S. And British vassalage in the 1970s, pre-revolution. But the Soros family was in on this game where their own personal portfolio companies and business enterprises were tied at the hip with U.S. diplomacy. This is more than 50 years ago, 1973. And this is something that has always been a part of U.S. foreign policy action because it's very powerful. This was how the U.S. waged war during the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, the United States announced essentially a kind of détente with Europe, that Europe would stay out of the Western Hemisphere and America would stay out of Tripoli and the like. And the way that the U.S. attained a kind of political vassalage over Central and South America was through U.S. commercial ventures, United Fruit and the like. These were the banana wars, and the associated big agriculture and big sugar ventures that were backed by the U.S. War Department, that were backed diplomatically by the U.S. State Department. And so you had this kind of trickle-down economic theory way before Reagan, this idea that that Americans will have cheap bananas and cheap sugar and these bountiful supply chains that would be administered by and taken over by U.S. private companies, but that would be protected and secured as a market by the U.S. War Department and the U.S. State Department, long before we ever had a CIA, long before we ever had a USAID. But once those were established in the 1940s and 1960s, the CIA first and then USAID, and then the 1980s with NED, this became totalizing for control, not just in a kind of military way through the War Department or in a kind of sanctions or top-down pressure from the State Department, but in the ability to have this kind of bottom-up civil society control over media, unions, universities, academics, arts and culture, and the like. But it has always been this way. It was not a new phenomenon. But essentially what George Soros did is in the 1980s, a lot of people think of George Soros as being this kind of, Democrat and Democrat only, and that is not the case. There's a tremendous amount of Republican overlap because of the big business side of the Republican Party, the international affairs side of the Republican Party, the John McCain, Mitt Romney, Nikki Haley side. And George Soros partnered in the 1980s when NED was set up. George Soros was a co-investor in those functions. And under the Republican executive branch, he partnered with the Republican Ronald Reagan world. John McCain was running the IRI at the time, by the way, and there's been a very close relationship between McCain and Soros from then until the day John McCain died. But this has been an operation. George Soros was betting on the currencies of all of the different Central and Eastern European countries that he was working with NED and the CIA and the State Department and USAID to overthrow. So he has insider trading knowledge. And think about this. He is competing against the entire market in terms of forex, foreign exchange speculation, but also in terms of all the fate of all the different industries. If you know that the CIA is going to topple this government because you're helping them do it, and you've got the national security clearances, and you've got the boots on the ground, and you're working every day with the local embassy, way before the market knows this happens, George Soros is able to take early positions with this insider knowledge to make billions of dollars in profits that the market has no hope of competing against because they're not working directly with state and CIA and USAID to know whether or not this thing is even happening, let alone know its chances of success. But this happens today with folks like Tom Donilon. Tom Donilon is the chairman of the BlackRock Investment Institute. Before that, he had never worked a day in his life. He was the national security advisor for Barack Obama. He was a high-ranking State Department official in the 1990s, helping on NATO expansion. He won the CIA Directors Award, and according to the New York Times, he was Joe Biden's first pick to be CIA director over Bill Burns. But Tom Donilon turned down CIA director so that he could continue to make millions as the chairman of the BlackRock Investment Institute. Meanwhile, Tom Donilon's brother, Mike Donilon, was the #1 senior advisor to Joe Biden in the White House and had been Joe Biden's senior advisor since 1986. So the CIA Director's Award winner in charge of U.S. intelligence and diplomacy, as well as in charge of NATO expansion, who's also on the board of the Global Leadership Coalition, the formal lobbying group for USAID and the State Department budget on Capitol Hill, is running the BlackRock Investment Institute, the in-house think tank for BlackRock's investment decision-makings, while he comes from the Central Intelligence Agency, was directly offered the #1 spot, chief of the Central Intelligence Agency, turns it down so that he can continue running BlackRock's investment arm, but can get updates every day from his brother, who's the #1 advisor to Joe Biden within the White House. This is how Soros Inc. operates. And it's important that this be completely restructured because U.S. foreign policy no longer serves U.S. citizens. It serves this reclusive, secular billionaires who use U.S. foreign policy for their own personal profit, whether it's good for the American people or not. And that has to end immediately, regardless of the collateral damage.